Hello everybody, welcome to Let's Talk Tech with Deep Core Data. Today we're going to be going through how to install a Debian web server. Today we're going to be installing Debian 8.2. I'm making this video in January of 2016 using the latest available version of Debian's downloads. If you're watching this video years from now, some of these interfaces may look considerably different. Our installation system in this video is a VMware Virtual Machine, although the installation procedure is similar across most hardware or virtual machine configurations. In this case, we'll simply mount the ISO to the virtual CD-ROM on this virtual machine. If you're installing on physical hardware, you would boot off a CD or USB stick on the target computer. Details on how to configure your computer to boot off a CD or USB stick should be included with your motherboard documentation. After booting the computer, we'll get the installer boot menu seen here. For our demonstration, we're going to use the graphical install. This demonstration also assumes you have a mouse attached to the machine you're installing on. The first screen we come across asks us what language we want to install in. I'm going to select English. The second screen asks what our location is. This is used primarily for time zone purposes, but also handles a myriad of tiny differences between nations. This list has been limited by my language selection, but if I really needed to, I could use the other selection at the bottom to choose a location not on this list. The next screen asks me what key map I want to use. This setting determines how the computer will interpret input from the keyboard. I'm going to choose American English. Now the installer is loading components off the ISO, CD, or USB stick to support the rest of the installation. Next is detection and configuration of the network hardware. This is critical because the ISO I downloaded to start this install only has about 280 megabytes of packages on it, just enough to get this installer all the functionality it needs. Most of the packages I might download are online, so I need to make sure my network is configured properly. If you're using very old or very new hardware, this is the most likely place you'll run into trouble. Next, the system will ask me for the hostname. The hostname is the name that the computer will use to identify itself both internally and to other computers on the network. I'm going to call it simply Debian Web Server, but if I were doing this for a particular project, I would try to name it something more descriptive. Here, we're being asked for our domain name. It's a bit beyond the scope of this video to get into exactly how to determine your domain name, but usually if you ping another computer on your network, you'll see it. This particular server will be living in our Winter data center, so its domain name is winter.deepcoredata.com. Next, the computer will ask you to set a password for the root account. A great deal has been written and said about how to select a good password, so I'll let you get advice on that elsewhere. Once you've chosen a password, though, you'll enter it here, twice. Next, the system will ask for a full name. This is the first step in setting up a personal user account, so I'll set it up for the system's primary user, John Brewer. The next screen is setting a username for my new account. By default, the system suggests you use your given name. This makes sense in a lot of circumstances in which a small number of users will use the machine. Some people and organizations use first initial or last name or full name or some other system. For example, I'll use the suggested username, John. Finally, in the user setup sequence, I'm asked to give a password for my personal account. This is distinct from the password we created for the root account earlier. This can be the same as the root password, although, again, there are serious considerations about what password you should use, and generally, this would be different from the password you entered earlier. After we set up our user account, we select the time zone for our machine. This has been limited by my earlier choice saying I was in the United States. If you're trying to set your computer to use UTC as its primary time zone, this can be a bit troublesome, but we can easily change the setting here once we've completed installation. Right now, I'm sitting in Boston, so I'm going to select the Eastern time zone. Now we're on to disk partitioning. There are an enormous number of options here that are far outside the scope of this video. Many different configurations are possible to optimize for some combination of performance, disaster resilience, and data security. For this example, though, we're simply going to allocate the entire disk as one block, so we'll use guided, use entire disk. On the partition disk screen, we only have one disk available, here labeled as SDA, so we'll select that. All files in one partition. Again, we're kind of assuming that if you're watching this video, you're building a sandbox or other non-production web server. For protection web servers, you'll likely want to exercise a more complicated partition structure. Now we confirm our decision and select Finish Partitioning and write changes to disk. Finally, we need to confirm our decision to partition the disk. Note that the default here is to not write the changes and to send you back to the partitioning selection screen. So, if you just keep hitting continue in this installer, this is where you'll start looping. Select yes and then click continue. Now we install the base system, which is the components that are absolutely required for basic functionality. These are the parts of the system that are actually on the CD or USB stick we're running off of. Once that's done, we choose where we'll be downloading the rest of the install packages from. I'm in the United States, so I'll choose that, and then I get a list of the actual servers I might download from. I'll go with the default here, ftp.us.debian.org. Next is the HTTP proxy. If you don't know what this is, you almost certainly don't have one. I do know what this is, and I still don't have one, so I'll just click through. We just have 2 more stops on this installation process. First, Popularity Contest is a subsystem that communicates usage statistics back to Debian's developers. By default, this is turned off, but if you'd like to provide input on what kind of systems you're using Debian on, you can turn it on. Finally, we have software selection. This is the place where we first really start customizing this server. The Debian desktop environment, GNOME, XFCE, KDE, Cinnamon, MATE, and LXDE are graphical user interfaces. We really don't need those on a web server, so we'll turn those off. However, we do want a web server, so I'll turn that on. We don't want to print from this machine, so I'll turn that off. We will want to use SSH to access the server, so we'll turn that on. The standard system utilities are just a very useful set of tools, so we'll leave those in, and then we continue. Now, the installation process is running. It will take a few minutes. Once we've installed the system, we need to configure the bootloader. This is the little bit of code that starts the operating system after the server is first turned on. We'll ask the server to install grub to the master boot record. Next, the installer will ask us where to install grub. We usually install on the first hard disk on the system, but since we only have one hard disk here, we'll select /dev/sda. Now, we just wait for the install to finish. Once the installation is completed, it is time to reboot. Just select continue. This blue box on the screen here is the grub bootloader we set up at the end of the install process. It will automatically boot us into Debian. Now, finally, the system has started, and we're looking at the Debian web server login screen. This concludes our video on installing Debian Linux 8.2. I hope you found this educational, and look for future videos on this channel, both about Debian and on other topics.